The courtroom stretched out before her, a cavernous expanse of cold, unyielding sterility that seemed to swallow sound and warmth alike. The air hung heavy with the sharp tang of polished wood, mingling with the stale, lingering ghost of coffee that had long since gone cold in styrofoam cups. Every breath carried a faint buzz of anticipation. A low hum woven from the murmured exchanges of lawyers flipping through dog-eared files, clerks shuffling papers with mechanical precision, and spectators shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They were all waiting, poised on the edge of something unspoken, as though the room itself held its breath for the next case to be called. And then, in an instant, that fragile stillness shattered, torn apart by a moment so visceral, so vicious, that it sucked the air from every lung and left the room suspended in stunned silence. She had only just lowered herself into the chair, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The seat bore a small placard, discreet but unmistakable, reserved for VIP guests. A spot meant for dignitaries and high-profile figures drawn to the trial's gravity. She hadn't even had time to adjust her jacket or settle her weight fully when the world tilted violently. A heavy boot slammed into her side with a force that felt like it could crack bone, sending her sprawling across the frigid marble floor. The impact reverberated, a sickening thud that bounced off the high walls, and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Papers she'd been holding fluttered to the ground, scattering in chaotic disarray, their crisp edges catching the light as they fell. Pain exploded through her ribs, sharp and searing, stealing her breath as she lay there, momentarily dazed. Above her, a voice cut through the haze, thick with venom and dripping with contempt. "Get the hell out of that seat, lady. This ain't for your kind." Her eyes fluttered open, blinking against the blur of faces swimming around her. Some stared wide-eyed, mouths agape in horror, their hands clutching armrests as if anchoring themselves to reality. Others sat rigid, faces carved from stone, unwilling, or perhaps unable, to move. She pushed herself up, hands trembling as they pressed against the cold floor, her breath hitching with every stab of pain that radiated from her side. The man towering over her wasn't just anyone. He was a cop. A white cop, his frame broad and imposing, built like a linebacker who'd spent years honing his body into a weapon. His uniform was pristine, starched to perfection, the badge pinned to his chest glinting menacingly under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights. He glared down at her, his eyes dark and unyielding, as though she were less than dirt beneath his heel, a pest to be crushed without a second thought. The certainty in his gaze was sickening. A quiet arrogance that screamed he believed no one would dare stop him. "Are you deaf?" he snapped, nudging her again with the toe of his boot, a casual cruelty in the gesture. "I said move." A murmur stirred through the crowd, soft and hesitant, like the rustle of leaves before a storm. Eyes darted nervously, some to the cop, some to her, some to the judge perched high on his bench, presiding over the room like a distant god. But no one spoke up. No one stood. Not even the judge, whose only reaction was to adjust his wire-rimmed glasses with a faint sigh, his attention drifting back to the case file splayed before him. To him, this was routine, a fleeting disturbance unworthy of his notice, another ripple in the endless tide of courtroom drama. She pulled herself upright, wincing as the pain clawed at her ribs, her fingers fumbling to smooth the wrinkled fabric of her jacket. Her chest burned with something hotter than the ache, a fury she forced herself to swallow, its bitter taste coating her throat. She met his gaze, locking eyes with the man who smirked down at her, his lips curling just enough to reveal the smug assurance that he could do this, do anything, and walk away unscathed. The whispers grew louder, a disjointed chorus of confusion and unease. "Did she do something?" one voice muttered. "Why isn't anyone stopping him?" another hissed. "She should just leave," a third suggested, timid and resigned. But then, cutting through the din like a blade, came a single voice, sharp, steady, and unafraid. you really have no idea who she is, do you? The words hung in the air, heavy and electric, slicing through the tension with surgical precision. For the first time, something flickered across the cop's face, uncertainty, a hairline crack in his unshakable confidence. He scoffed, shaking his head as if to dismiss the notion, his voice rough with defiance. And why the hell would I care? Silence descended, thick and suffocating. Every eye in the room now riveted on the woman who still hadn't spoken. She stood there, bruised and humiliated, her dignity trampled under the weight of his boot. Yet there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, a resilience that seemed to hum beneath her skin. She exhaled slowly, the breath trembling as it left her lips. The enormity of what had just happened pressing against her chest like a lead weight. And then she took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. Her presence suddenly commanding in a way that made the air shift. One sentence, one revelation, was all it would take to unravel everything this man thought he knew about power, about privilege. About the untouchable pedestal he'd built for himself. Because he hadn't just kicked any woman. He had kicked Monique Thompson, the governor of the state. And what unfolded next would leave the courtroom, and everyone in it, reeling in stunned disbelief. The morning sun barely pierced the thick shroud of gray clouds draped over Atlanta, casting long, jagged shadows across the imposing stone facade of the courthouse. The building loomed like a monolith, its weathered walls etched with the scars of centuries, some chapters steeped in righteousness, most stained by the enduring rot of injustice. Monique Thompson stepped through its grand entrance, her heel striking the marble floor with a crisp, measured rhythm that echoed faintly in the cavernous hall. No heads turned. No whispers trailed in her wake. Today, she wasn't the woman whose face adorned billboards, whose policies had redrawn the state's future, whose name sparked both reverence and rage. Today, she was just another black woman navigating a system that had never bent to welcome her, a system she'd spent her life dismantling, brick by stubborn brick. The air inside was dense, saturated with the musty scent of yellowed paper, the gleam of polished wood, and the ever-present undercurrent of tension that clung to places like this. Courtrooms weren't sanctuaries of justice. She knew. They were theaters of control, stages where order was preserved and power flexed, often at the expense of those it was meant to protect. She'd learned that lesson early. Back when she was a young attorney fresh from law school, her eyes bright with hope and her heart ablaze with purpose. She'd walked into rooms like this believing she could tip the scales, only to discover that justice wasn't a gift, it was a battle, and even victory left a hollow ache. Today, though, was meant to be simple. A high-profile case had drawn national scrutiny. A young black man, unarmed, gunned down in his own driveway by officers who'd claimed confusion, fear, a tragic mistake. The defense spun a tale of chaos and split-second decisions. The prosecution countered with charges of recklessness, bias, and a system that branded black skin a threat. Monique had come to watch, to sit silently in the back. To see how justice, or its shadow, played out under the weight of a nation's gaze. She'd dressed modestly for the occasion, a navy blazer that hugged her frame with understated elegance. Tailored slacks that whispered authority without shouting it, and flat shoes in place of her usual heels. No entourage flanked her, no reporters dogged her steps. No trappings of the power she wielded shadowed her presence. She wanted to blend in, to slip into the room unnoticed, to feel the pulse of the place without her title skewing the rhythm. It was a habit born of her roots, a reminder of the girl who'd grown up on Atlanta's South Side, the daughter of a teacher and a mechanic. Who'd clawed her way to the governor's mansion through sheer will and unrelenting grit. But that morning, the courthouse thrummed with a different energy. A taut undercurrent of unease that prickled her skin. It lived in the darting glances of lawyers hunched over briefs, the restless adjustments of officers tugging at their belts. The forced nonchalance of clerks who averted their eyes from the invisible lines dividing the room. And then there was Officer Travis Holt. He stood near the front. Arms crossed over a chest broad enough to block out the light, his uniform crisp as if ironed with military precision. 15 years on the force had honed him into something formidable. A man who carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd learned the rules could bend, or break, in his favor. Complaints had shadowed him over the years: excessive force, misconduct. A temper that flared too easily. But complaints were just words on paper, meaningless without teeth, and consequences had never sunk their claws into him. He was untouchable, or so he believed. His confidence forged in the fires of a system that rarely held men like him accountable. His eyes swept the room, predatory and restless. Until they landed on her, on the woman who dared to sit in the VIP section, her posture calm, her presence unapologetic. Something about her gnawed at him, the quiet dignity in her shoulders. The way she met his stare without flinching. She didn't shrink, didn't cower, and that defiance, however subtle, lit a fuse deep in his gut. He moved toward her without a second thought. His boots thudding against the marble with a rhythm that silenced the room. The crowd parted instinctively, their whispers fading into a tense hush. She barely had time to register his approach before his boot crashed into her side, the blow sending her tumbling from the chair in a graceless heap. Pain erupted. A white-hot flare that stole her breath and left her gasping against the cold floor. Her papers scattered like fallen leaves, a chaotic testament to the violence that had upended her. Above her, Holt loomed, his shadow swallowing the light, his voice a guttural snarl. "Get the hell out of that seat, lady. This ain't for your kind." The words landed like blows. Each syllable laced with a hatred so raw it made her stomach twist. She pushed herself up, her hands shaking, her ribs screaming with every movement. The room spun briefly. Faces blurring into a kaleidoscope of shock and apathy, but she forced herself to stand, to face him. Holt's smirk widened as he watched her struggle. His eyes glinting with the certainty that he'd won, that no one would challenge him, that this was his domain. He nudged her again, a lazy prod of his boot, as if she were an animal to be herded. The crowd murmured, a low rumble of unease, but no one stepped forward. The judge, perched above it all, merely adjusted his glasses and turned a page. His disinterest a silent endorsement of the chaos below. Monique's chest burned, not just with pain but with a rage she'd spent decades learning to tame. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the whispers swelling into a disjointed hum of confusion and cowardice. And then that voice, clear, cutting, defiant, pierced the air. "You really have no idea who she is, do you?" Holt faltered, just for a heartbeat, his bravado flickering like a candle in the wind. He laughed, a harsh, barking sound, and spat back. "And why the hell would I care?" But the room had shifted, the tension coiling tighter, every gaze now locked on Monique. She straightened, her breath steadying despite the ache. Her eyes boring into his with a fire that could melt steel. She took a step forward, and in that moment, the truth unfurled like a banner: she was no ordinary woman. She was the governor. A titan of power and resilience, and Holt's world was about to crumble under the weight of his own arrogance. The lesson here cuts deeper than the bruise on her ribs or the smirk wiped from Holt's face. Justice, when it comes, isn't always swift or loud, it's a slow burn. A reckoning that builds in the shadows of abused power. Holt thought his badge was a shield, his authority a license to degrade and dominate. But power unchecked is a house of cards. Fragile and doomed to fall when faced with someone who refuses to break. Monique's triumph wasn't just in her title, it was in her refusal to let his cruelty define her. In the quiet strength that turned his hubris into his undoing. And for those who stood by, silent and complicit, the aftermath was a mirror held up to their inaction, a reminder that justice demands courage, not just from its victims, but from its witnesses too. In the stillness of that courtroom, a heavy silence had settled over the room like a fog rolling in off a restless sea, thick and unyielding. Officer Travis Holt stood there, his broad shoulders squared, chest puffed out as though he owned the very air around him. His voice, low and cutting, sliced through the quiet with the precision of a blade honed for intimidation. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think you're doing," he said, his tone dripping with disdain, "but that seat isn't for you." His words weren't a suggestion, they were a command. Barked with the certainty of a man who'd never had to question his own authority. His lips curled into something sharp and ugly, not quite a smile but a grimace of triumph. As if he'd already won whatever game he thought they were playing. She didn't flinch. The woman seated before him turned her head slowly, her face a mask of unreadable calm. Her eyes locked onto his. Steady and unflinching, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. She didn't rise, didn't shrink. Didn't even blink, just held his gaze with a stillness that seemed to unnerve him more than any defiance could have. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but firm, a thread of steel woven through it. "You're excused," Holt snapped back, his smirk widening as he leaned slightly forward, towering over her. "Now get up. That section's reserved for important guests." The way he spat the word, important, carried a weight that left no room for misinterpretation. It was a line drawn in the sand, a declaration of who belonged and who didn't. Around them, the room seemed to hold its breath. Eyes flickered nervously from one face to the other, some spectators averting their gazes, pretending to busy themselves with papers or whispers. While others leaned in, their attention hooked on the slow unraveling of something raw and inevitable. She didn't budge. Her silence was a wall, unyielding and deliberate. Behind her, a man in the next row shifted uncomfortably, his mouth opening as if to intervene. "Do you even know who?" he began, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and urgency. But Holt cut him off with a sharp jerk of his head. "I don't care who she is," he snarled, his patience fraying like a rope stretched too thin. "She needs to move. Now." And then it happened, so fast that the room seemed to stutter, caught off guard by the sheer brutality of the moment. Before anyone could react, before a single gasp could fully form, Holt's boot lashed out, striking her side with a force that echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap. The impact was sickening, a dull, meaty thud that reverberated in the bones of everyone watching. She crumpled to the floor, papers scattering around her like fallen leaves. The air thick with stunned murmurs and a whispered, "Oh my God," from somewhere near the back. Pain exploded through her ribs, a white-hot flare that radiated outward, stealing her breath. But it wasn't the physical agony that rooted her to the spot, it was the audacity, the cold, unflinching certainty of his actions. He hadn't hesitated, hadn't paused to consider the consequences. Because why would he? Men like Travis Holt never did. They moved through the world like untouchable gods, their power a shield they wielded without thought. For a fleeting moment, the world blurred around her, sounds muffled as though she were submerged underwater, the chaos of the room struggling to reach her through the haze. But then she moved. Slowly, deliberately. She pushed herself up from the cold, hard floor, her hands trembling not from fear but from a fury she kept tightly leashed. As she rose, she caught the expressions of those around her, wide-eyed horror from some, uneasy discomfort from others, and a silent, shameful complicity from far too many. Something deep within her clicked into place, a burning clarity that seared through the pain. This wasn't just an attack on her body. It was a revelation of a truth she'd known all along, a truth about men like Holt, about the systems that propped them up. About the countless others who'd faced this same violence and been erased by it. Holt, oblivious to the shift, smirked again, rolling his shoulders back as though dusting off an inconvenience. "You're going to learn to listen," he muttered, his voice laced with a casual arrogance that made her stomach turn. He turned slightly, as if to address the room. To bask in the dominance he assumed was still his. But before he could finish, before he could sink deeper into the delusion of his own invincibility, a voice sliced through the air, cold, sharp, and commanding, like the crack of a whip in the stillness. "You have no idea what you just did." The words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that made Holt freeze. For the first time. That smug grin faltered, a flicker of uncertainty darting across his face. Something had changed. The air in the courtroom grew heavier, oppressive. As though the walls themselves were bearing witness to a reckoning. The people around him shifted. Their eyes no longer averted but fixed on him with a new intensity, not the passive resignation he was used to, but something sharper, something alive with recognition. The balance had tipped. And he could feel it, even if he didn't yet understand why. She straightened fully now, adjusting her blazer with a slow, deliberate grace that belied the ache pulsing through her side. Governor Monique Thompson stood tall, her presence filling the room like a tide rolling in, steady and unstoppable. There was no outburst, no tears. No visible rage, just a stillness that radiated power, a quiet that demanded attention. Holt's smirk was gone now, replaced by a tightening of his jaw. A twitch in his hands as they curled into fists at his sides. He was still trying to piece it together, still clinging to the belief that he could talk his way out of this. That the world would bend to his will as it always had. The truth hit him like a slow, creeping shadow. He hadn't just assaulted some nameless woman. He'd struck the most powerful woman in the state. A black woman who'd clawed her way to the top through years of fighting battles he couldn't even fathom. And in that single, reckless act, he'd ignited a fire he couldn't extinguish. The room erupted into a chaotic flurry. The clerk fumbled with a stack of papers, sending them fluttering to the floor like panicked birds. The judge's gavel slammed against the desk. A desperate attempt to reclaim order, but the sound was swallowed by the rising tide of whispers and gasps. "That's the governor," someone near the front breathed. The words trembling with awe and disbelief. Holt's breath hitched, his eyes darting to the judge, then to the other officers stationed around the room, searching for an ally. For the familiar script of protection that had always saved him before. But no one moved. The shields he'd relied on were crumbling, leaving him exposed. "This is a misunderstanding," he forced out. Straightening his back, clinging to a confidence that was slipping through his fingers like sand. "She was in the wrong section. I was just doing my job." His voice sounded hollow, even to himself. The excuse flimsy against the weight of what he'd done. Monique tilted her head, her gaze never wavering. "Your job," she echoed, a sharp exhale punctuating the words. "My job is to maintain order. To ensure security," he pressed, though the conviction had drained from his tone. "I didn't know who she was." The courtroom shifted again, a subtle ripple of realization spreading through the crowd. That was the crux of it, wasn't it? He hadn't known who she was, and that ignorance was his crime as much as the violence itself. He'd acted without question, without hesitation. Because he'd assumed she was powerless, because men like him had always gotten away with it before. But now the tide was turning, and he was caught in its pull. The judge's gavel cracked down once more, his voice strained with frustration. "I need order in this courtroom," he barked, but the command fell flat. A hollow echo in a space that no longer belonged to him. Monique took a step forward, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "So," she said, her voice slow and deliberate, "you didn't know who I was. That's your excuse?" Holt's jaw tightened, his mind racing for a defense, but she didn't give him the chance. "Tell me, Officer Holt," she continued, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "Would it have made a difference if you had known?" The question hung between them, heavy and unrelenting, stripping away the last vestiges of his bravado. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The answer was painfully clear, and in that silence, he felt the full weight of his mistake crash down on him. Monique drew a sharp breath, her ribs aching with every movement. But she stood unwavering, turning slightly to address the room. "This is what happens when power is abused," she said, her voice steady and resonant, filling every corner of the space. "When authority becomes a weapon instead of a responsibility. This isn't just about me, it's about every person who's faced this kind of violence, with no cameras, no witnesses, no justice." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, growing louder, more certain. Holt's breaths came shorter now, his hands trembling at his sides. The lesson was clear. Etched into the very air around them, justice wasn't just a word, it was a force, and the consequences of wielding power without accountability were inescapable. For Monique, this moment was a culmination of every fight she'd endured, a testament to the resilience that had carried her here. For Holt, it was the beginning of a fall he'd never seen coming. Travis Holt stood frozen, his breath shallow and ragged, as the chaos of the moment spiraled beyond his grasp, slipping through his fingers like sand in a storm. His heart thudded violently in his chest, a relentless drumbeat echoing in his ears, drowning out the world around him. For the first time in his life, he felt the ground beneath him tremble. Unsteady and unfamiliar, as if the very foundation of his existence had begun to crack. Monique Thompson turned slowly toward him, her face a mask of calm he couldn't pierce. Her dark eyes glinting with something unreadable, something that sent a shiver racing down his spine. "So tell me, Officer Holt," she said, her voice low and deliberate. Each word dripping with a quiet intensity that made his stomach twist, "what do you think happens next?" He couldn't answer. His tongue felt heavy, useless. Stuck to the roof of his mouth as his pulse roared louder, a frantic rhythm he couldn't quiet. He'd spent 15 years wearing the badge. Cloaked in the unshakable certainty that the system would always bend to protect him. But now, staring into Monique's unflinching gaze, that certainty crumbled. Somewhere behind him, the double doors of the room burst open with a groan, the sound sharp and jarring in the tense silence. Heavy footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor, more officers, but not the kind he'd hoped for. These weren't his brothers in blue rushing to his defense. These were the high-ups, the brass from internal affairs, men and women in crisp suits with faces carved from stone. Normally, they'd have been his allies, the ones who'd slap him on the back and sweep inconvenient truths under the rug. But today, their eyes were cold, their lips pressed into thin, unyielding lines. They weren't here to save him. Monique took a single step closer, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. Her voice dropped to a whisper, soft but cutting. Meant for his ears alone. "I hope you enjoyed the power while you had it," she murmured, and the words landed like a punch to his gut. Travis Holt, a man who'd spent his career towering over others, felt something unfamiliar clawing at his chest, powerlessness. The walls seemed to inch closer, the air growing thick and oppressive, pressing against his lungs. And the worst part? This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The heavy oak door to the courthouse conference room slammed shut with a resounding click. The sound reverberating through the space like a judge's gavel sealing a verdict. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating, laden with the weight of unspoken accusations and the bitter tang of betrayal. Travis sat at the long wooden table, his broad shoulders hunched, his jaw locked so tight the muscles ached with a dull, persistent throb. His uniform, once a symbol of authority he'd worn with pride, now felt like a straitjacket, the fabric itching against his skin, the starched collar digging into his neck. Beads of sweat prickled at the base of his skull, sliding down his spine as his fingers curled into fists beneath the table, knuckles whitening with the effort to hold himself together. Across from him sat Monique Thompson, her posture impeccable. Her hands folded neatly atop the polished wood. She was a picture of composure, her tailored blazer crisp and her expression an enigma, steady, unyielding, yet alive with a quiet fire that made Travis's stomach churn. The room wasn't crowded, but the few present carried weight, legal advisors with their notepads poised, department heads shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and a stern-faced representative from the governor's office whose gaze seemed to bore straight through him. They all watched, waiting, their silence louder than any shout. Travis's mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of denial and dread. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He'd spent a decade and a half building his life on the force, shielded by the unspoken code that protected men like him, white, male, uniformed. The system had always been his armor, deflecting scrutiny, burying complaints. But now, that armor was cracking, and he could feel the cold seeping in. Monique leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting on the table, her voice cutting through the haze of his thoughts. "You understand the position you're in, don't you?" she asked, her tone measured but laced with an undercurrent of steel, something final. Something that made his skin prickle. He scoffed, though the sound came out brittle, weaker than he'd intended. "This is a damn witch hunt," he muttered, shaking his head as if he could shake off the reality closing in around him. "I was doing my job." She was in the wrong place, and Monique's hand rose. A simple gesture that silenced him as effectively as a gunshot. "Stop," she said, the word sharp and commanding, carrying the weight of years, of moments where men like him had talked over women like her, where their excuses had been lifelines tossed out to save their own skins. His mouth snapped shut, and she exhaled slowly, her eyes locked on his, unrelenting. "You assaulted the governor of this state," she continued, her voice flat, devoid of warmth, in front of witnesses, in a courtroom. "And now you want to talk about doing your job?" Travis shifted in his seat, the pressure in his chest building, a tight knot of panic and rage. "I didn't know," he started, but she cut him off again, her interruption smooth and merciless. "And that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't know. But you assumed. And because you assumed, you felt entitled to violence." His fists tightened, nails biting into his palms until he felt the sting of broken skin. "This is," he began, his voice a low growl, but she didn't let him finish. Her expression darkened, her patience wearing thin. A storm brewing behind her calm facade. "What did I do, Officer Holt?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, her tone deceptively soft. "Did I resist? Did I threaten you? Did I do anything other than sit down in a chair?" The silence that followed was deafening, stretching taut between them like a wire ready to snap. He could feel the eyes of the others in the room, legal advisors scribbling notes, department heads avoiding his gaze, the governor's rep staring with quiet disdain. He could feel his world unraveling, thread by thread. Monique sighed, a sound heavy with exhaustion, as if this confrontation was just another chapter in a story she'd lived too many times. "I've spent my entire life fighting against men like you," she said, her voice softening but losing none of its edge. "Men who think power is theirs to wield without consequence. And for too long. You were right." His pulse hammered against his skull, a relentless assault that matched the desperation rising in his throat. "You're going to ruin my life over one mistake," he snapped, his voice cracking with raw, unfiltered fear. "One damn mistake." A humorless laugh escaped her lips, sharp and bitter, cutting through the air like a blade. "One mistake," she echoed, incredulous, shaking her head. "Is that what you think this was?" Travis swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper, his hands trembling beneath the table. Monique leaned in just a fraction, her voice dropping to a whisper that hit him like a sledgehammer. "You're not here because of one mistake, Officer Holt. You're here because this time, you picked the wrong person." The truth in her words twisted in his gut, a sickening realization that stole the air from his lungs. She sat back, folding her hands with a grace that belied the storm she'd unleashed. "Do you know how many complaints have been filed against you?" she asked, her tone almost conversational. He didn't answer, couldn't, but she didn't need him to. 11, she said, letting the number hang in the air like a guillotine blade. 11 excessive force complaints. 7 from black citizens. 5 from black women. His jaw clenched tighter, but he held his silence. The weight of her gaze pinning him in place. "What happened today wasn't an accident," she went on, her voice steady and unrelenting. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern, one that's finally caught up with you." The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in, the air growing heavy with the crushing weight of her words. She exhaled, pushing back from the table, and the movement felt like the shifting of tectonic plates. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, and the room stilled, every eye trained on her. "As of now, you're on immediate suspension without pay. A full internal investigation is being launched. And depending on the findings, which, let's be honest, we both know how that's going to go, your badge will be stripped, and you'll face criminal charges for assault." Panic clawed at his chest, a wild, desperate thing tearing at his insides. "No," he said, shaking his head furiously, as if he could will her words away. "You can't." "I can," she interrupted smoothly, her voice a blade slicing through his protest. "And I will." He shot to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, the sound grating in the tense silence. "This is political," he hissed, his voice trembling with fury and fear. "This is personal." Monique's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as she rose to meet him. "You're right," she said, her tone as sharp as shattered glass. "It is personal. It's personal for every black man and woman who's ever been brutalized by someone like you. It's personal for every family who's had to bury their loved ones because a cop thought their life didn't matter." His breathing came in uneven gasps, his chest heaving as the weight of her words crashed over him. "This isn't how this works," he said, his voice breaking, fractured by the fear he couldn't hide. "People like me," he stopped himself. But it was too late. The unspoken end of that sentence hung in the air, heavy and damning. People like me don't lose. People like me don't face consequences. People like me don't fall. But he was falling, plummeting into an abyss he'd never imagined. Monique watched him for a long, agonizing moment, her gaze piercing through the layers of bravado he'd built over the years. Then she stood, smoothing the front of her blazer with a calm that felt almost mocking. "You've had 15 years of power, Officer Holt," she said, her voice steady and final. "I hope you enjoyed it while it lasted." His vision blurred, his pulse a deafening roar in his ears as she stepped toward the door. She paused just before reaching it, turning slightly, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Oh, and one more thing," she added, her tone light but laced with menace. "You might want to check the news. Your story's already out." And then she was gone. The door clicking shut behind her with a sound that echoed like a death knell. Travis stumbled back into his chair, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his phone. His fingers slipped over the screen. Clumsy and unsteady, his breath hitching as the murmurs of the room faded into a dull hum. He didn't need to look to know what awaited him, but some desperate, foolish part of him clung to the hope that this wasn't real, that he could still claw his way out. But then the screen lit up, and there it was, his face splashed across every news outlet. Headline screaming in bold, unforgiving letters: "Georgia officer suspended after assaulting governor in courtroom scandal." His stomach dropped, the world tilting beneath him as the walls closed in tighter, the air thick with the bitter taste of justice, a justice he'd never believed would touch him. In that moment, Travis Holt understood something profound: power, when abused, didn't just fade, it turned on you, sharp and unrelenting, a blade forged by every life you trampled in its name. And as the consequences of his actions loomed larger, he realized this wasn't just about him. It was about every officer who'd ever hidden behind a badge, every system that had let them. And every voice, like Monique's, that had finally risen to demand accountability. The lesson was clear, etched in the ruins of his career: justice, when it came, spared no one. And the fall from power was a long, hard drop indeed. Travis Holt hunched over his phone, the glow of the screen casting jagged shadows across his sweat-slicked face. His stomach churned violently. A tight knot of dread twisting deeper with every swipe of his thumb. His breaths came in short, jagged bursts, as if the air itself had turned against him. Article after article scrolled past, headlines screaming of racism, brutality, and a courtroom assault that had set the nation ablaze with outrage. There was video evidence, undeniable and everywhere. Clips flooded news broadcasts, looped endlessly on social media feeds, even surfaced on obscure platforms he'd never bothered to explore. With a trembling finger, he tapped one. And the footage roared to life. There he was, preserved in crisp, merciless detail, his broad shoulders squared with arrogance, his lips curled into a sneer dripping with contempt. His polished boots gleamed under the courtroom lights as he drove a forceful kick into the governor's side, sending her crumpling to the floor like discarded trash. Her gasp of pain was faint but piercing, a sound that now echoed in his skull. Then came his own voice, brash and venomous, slicing through the chaos: "Get the hell out of that seat, lady. This ain't for your kind." The words hit him like a slap, foreign yet unmistakably his own. Back then, they'd spilled from his mouth with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Now, they clawed at his insides, damning him with every syllable. A sharp rap at the door jolted him upright. His heart slammed against his ribs, a frantic rhythm he couldn't steady. Two men stepped inside. Their dark suits crisp against the dim light of his cramped apartment. Internal Affairs. He knew their faces instantly: Agents Carter and Reese, stone-faced and unyielding. Carter's eyes, sharp and gray, held a glint of something Travis couldn't place: pity, maybe, or cold satisfaction. Reese, broader and quieter, stood like a wall, his presence alone radiating judgment. "Officer Holt," Carter said, his voice smooth but edged with steel, "we need to speak with you." Travis swallowed, his throat sandpaper dry. His mind raced, scrambling for a lifeline, an excuse, a deflection. Anything to claw his way out of this pit. But nothing came. His legs wobbled as he forced himself to stand, the floor tilting beneath him. "This is getting blown out of proportion," he croaked. His voice hoarse and unsteady. "I didn't know who she was, I didn't mean." Carter raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "We're not here to debate. As of this moment, you're on unpaid leave pending investigation." The words landed like a punch, stealing the air from Travis's lungs. "Unpaid," his voice faltered. "I have a family. I have bills." "You'll want to secure legal counsel," Reese interjected, his tone colder than the tiled floor beneath them. "This isn't just internal anymore. The governor's office has requested a criminal probe. The DA's reviewing charges." Travis's world lurched sideways. Criminal charges, the phrase rattled in his skull, absurd and impossible. "This is insane," he muttered, shaking his head as if he could dislodge the reality sinking in. "You're acting like I committed some felony. I was doing my job." Carter's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "Your job doesn't include assaulting a sitting governor in front of dozens of witnesses." Travis barked a laugh, bitter and hollow, the sound bouncing off the walls. "She's making an example out of me," he snapped, his voice rising with desperation. "She wants revenge. Reese didn't flinch. "No," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "She wants justice." The word hung heavy in the air, a gavel striking Travis's fragile defiance. He opened his mouth to argue, to spit back something defiant, but the words lodged in his throat, choking him. His chest burned, a wildfire of panic and shame consuming him from within. The door swung open again, and this time it was Captain Daniels who stepped through. His weathered face, usually creased with stern authority, now carried something worse, resignation. His salt and pepper hair caught the light as he rubbed a hand over his jaw, exhaustion etched into every line. "Holt," he said, his voice gravelly and low, "we need to talk." Travis nodded stiffly, his breath shallow as he followed the captain into the courthouse's bustling hallway. The place was a tempest now, cameras flashing like lightning, reporters swarming like vultures, their shouted questions blending into a deafening roar. Security had tripled. Uniformed officers weaving through the chaos with clipped efficiency. Travis caught glimpses of his colleagues in the crowd, some whispered behind cupped hands. Others turned away as if he were contagious. A few stared outright, their eyes burning with disgust, a look he'd never seen aimed at him before. It slithered over his skin, cold and suffocating. As strangers parted to avoid brushing against him, Daniels led him to a quieter corridor, the heavy door thudding shut behind them, muffling the storm outside. The air here was stale, thick with the weight of what was coming. "I tried," the captain said, his voice rough with regret. "I tried to keep you safe, Holt. Covered for you too many times, those bar fights. The complaints I buried. I thought you were a good cop with a hot head. But this?" He shook his head, his eyes dark with disappointment. "This is on you. And there's no saving you now." Travis felt something fracture inside him, a sharp crack splitting his composure. "So that's it," he rasped. "You're just throwing me away." Daniels sighed. A sound heavy with years of battles fought and lost. "You threw yourself away." "I can fix this," Travis pleaded, his voice trembling with desperation. "If I apologize." "Make a statement," Daniels cut him off, his patience snapping. "You don't get it. You assaulted the most powerful black woman in the state, on camera, in a courthouse. With the whole damn country watching. There's no fixing that." Travis's pulse thundered in his ears, a relentless drumbeat of fear. "So what? I'm just supposed to let them destroy my life? My pension, my benefits?" Daniels's voice turned flat, devoid of warmth. "You won't have any of that. Your career's gone. And you better hope they don't lock you up with the same men you put away." The word prison sliced through him, sharp and visceral. Panic surged, hot and wild, clawing at his chest. He'd spent years slamming cell doors shut, never imagining one could close on him. "No," he whispered, stepping back, his hand groping for the wall as his vision blurred. "This isn't happening." Daniels's phone buzzed, a harsh interruption. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening as he exhaled. "They're coming for you," he said simply. "And there's nothing I can do." Travis's legs buckled, his palm pressing hard against the wall to keep from collapsing. He'd seen careers end, cops stripped of badges, some even cuffed and hauled off, but never like this, never with the nation's eyes boring into him, demanding retribution. "I can't go to prison," he choked out, his voice breaking. The captain's gaze didn't soften. "Then you should have thought of that before you kicked the governor of Georgia in a courtroom full of cameras." A knock echoed through the corridor, firm and final. Time was up. For the first time, Travis Holt tasted powerlessness, a bitter, suffocating thing that coated his tongue and stole his breath. Later, he sat in an interrogation room, the dull gray walls closing in like a vice. A flickering fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, casting stark shadows across his ashen face. His hands, once steady enough to wield a baton or cuff a suspect, now quaked against the cold metal table. The room reeked of stale coffee and sweat. But all he could hear was the silence, a crushing void that replaced the courthouse's gasps and murmurs. His arrogance had crumbled, leaving only the wreckage of a man who'd built his life on borrowed invincibility. The door creaked open, and Travis flinched but didn't look up. A chair scraped across the floor, and Detective James Porter settled across from him with deliberate calm. Porter was a lean man, his dark eyes unreadable beneath a mop of unruly brown hair. Travis knew him well, too well. Porter had turned a blind eye to Travis's temper before, dismissing complaints with a shrug, bound by the same unspoken loyalty that shielded cops like them. But now, that loyalty was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. "Officer Holt," Porter said, his voice steady as stone. Travis swallowed hard, meeting the detective's gaze at last. Those eyes held no trace of the old camaraderie, only a mirror reflecting the consequences Travis could no longer outrun. Justice, it seemed, wasn't just a word, it was a force. Relentless and impartial, and it had come for him. The lesson burned deep: power abused was power lost, and the fall was as swift as it was deserved. In the stifling stillness of the interrogation room, Travis Holt sat hunched over the cold metal table, his jaw locked tight, muscles twitching with a fury he could barely contain. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if it were pressing down on him with the weight of his own unraveling life. There was no buffer this time. No familiar shadow to step in and shield him from the storm he'd brewed. Porter, his longtime partner, the one who'd always had his back through every questionable call and every blurred line, wasn't here to smooth things over. Travis's voice scraped out, rough and jagged, like he'd been gargling shards of glass. "This is a damn setup," he muttered, his words trembling with a mix of defiance and dread. His mind raced, replaying every moment that had led him here, searching for a crack, a way out, anything to cling to. But deep down, a gnawing realization clawed at him: this wasn't just another mess he could dodge. Across the table, Porter leaned back in his chair, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face a stone mask that betrayed nothing. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of his calm, deliberate stare. "No, Travis," he said, his voice steady, cutting through the haze like a blade. "This is accountability." The word landed hard, a thunderclap in the silence, and Travis felt it ripple through him, a cold, shuddering jolt he refused to let show. He forced out a laugh, sharp and hollow, echoing off the bare walls like a gunshot. "Come on, man," he said, his tone dripping with bitter sarcasm. "You and I both know how this game works. We look out for each other. That's how it's always been." His eyes darted to Porter's, desperate for a flicker of recognition, a hint of the old loyalty that had carried them through years of bending rules and burying secrets. But Porter's gaze held no warmth, no lifeline, just a quiet, unshakable resolve that made Travis's stomach twist into knots. For years, Travis had worn his badge like armor. A shield that made him untouchable, a king in a world where power was his birthright. He'd walked through chaos with his head high, his decisions unquestioned, his actions excused by a system that bent to protect its own. But now, that system had turned on him, its gears grinding slowly but relentlessly toward a reckoning he'd never imagined. Porter sighed, a sound heavy with exhaustion, and slid a thick manila folder across the table. The faint rustle of paper felt deafening in the tense air. "You don't get it, Holt," he said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't some petty infraction we can sweep under the rug. We're talking felony assault charges, serious time. You think this'll just vanish? That you'll walk away with a slap on the wrist?" Travis scoffed, shaking his head, his bravado a flimsy mask over the panic rising in his chest. "This is insane," he snapped, but the words faltered, dying on his tongue. He couldn't finish the denial. He'd seen the footage, heard his own voice barking those damning words, felt the sickening thud of his boot against flesh. There was no erasing it. Porter flipped open the folder, his eyes skimming the neatly typed lines before locking back onto Travis. "Even if you take a plea, you're done. The badge? Gone. Your pension? Wiped out. The union won't come near this, they're treating you like a plague." Travis's throat tightened, a dry, choking sensation that made it hard to swallow. "That's not true," he rasped. But the lie tasted bitter, hollow. Porter tilted his head, his expression shifting into something almost pitying, a look that sent a fresh wave of nausea through Travis. "You haven't checked your phone, have you?" he asked, his tone soft but pointed. Travis's hands twitched toward his pocket, then froze. He didn't need to look, he could already picture it. The silence from his buddies, the unanswered calls, the slow fade of every connection he'd taken for granted. His so-called brothers in blue, the ones he'd shared beers and bravado with, had abandoned ship, leaving him to drown alone. "They're throwing you to the wolves," Porter continued, his voice steady but laced with a grim edge. "The department's already released a statement, condemning you, washing their hands of it. Your captain's dodging your calls. The mayor went on live TV, calling for your head." He paused, leaning in just enough to make the air between them feel charged, electric. "They're going to make an example out of you, Travis. For once, the system's not bending over backward to save you." The words sank into Travis like lead, settling deep in his gut, a sickening ache that drowned out the anger he'd always relied on. He clenched his teeth, trying to summon the fire. The righteous fury that had fueled him through every close call. But all he found was a cold, creeping fear, a void where his confidence used to be. "They can't lock me up," he said, quieter now. His voice fragile, as if he were pleading with himself more than Porter. "They won't." But the conviction was gone, replaced by a tremor of doubt. Porter watched him, his eyes sharp, assessing. Like a hunter sizing up wounded prey. "You still think you're untouchable, don't you?" he said, almost sadly. Travis didn't answer, couldn't find the words. Porter sighed again, closing the folder with a soft thud. "You've got two roads here. Fight it, take it to court, roll the dice with the whole damn country watching. Or take the deal, resign, cooperate, stay out of a cell." Travis's head jerked up, his breath catching. "Stay out of prison," he echoed, the words foreign, surreal. Porter nodded, his face unreadable. "They'll still tear your life apart, rip away everything you've built. But you'd keep your freedom. Maybe start over somewhere new, far from all this." Start over. The phrase hung in the air, absurd. Impossible. For 15 years, Travis had been the one with the power, the one who called the shots, the one who walked through the world like it owed him something. Now, they were asking him to strip it all away, to become a ghost of the man he'd been. His mouth felt like sand, dry and useless, when he finally spoke. "And if I don't?" Porter's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "Then you gamble. But I'll tell you this, Travis, if this goes to trial, you're finished. You'll lose everything, and you'll go down hard." The room seemed to close in. The walls pressing tighter, the air thinning until Travis couldn't breathe. His chest ached, a vice squeezing his ribs, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of rage and despair. Everything he'd built, his career, his identity, his invincibility, was crumbling, slipping through his fingers like dust. "I need time," he murmured, barely audible. His voice lost in the storm inside him. Porter stood, the chair scraping against the floor with a slow, deliberate screech that echoed in the silence. "You don't have much of it," he said. Then turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that hit Travis like a punch. Alone now, the silence roared, heavy and oppressive, wrapping around him like chains. His hands curled into fists, nails digging into his palms, then fell limp, useless. He reached for his phone with trembling fingers, dreading what he'd find. The screen lit up. A flood of unread messages glowing in the dim light, names he knew, faces he'd trusted, all pulling away. Colleagues who'd once slapped his back in camaraderie now sent curt, cold texts, "Don't call." Friends who'd shared late-night laughs now typed excuses, their words dripping with fear and distance. One message stopped him cold, his breath hitching painfully, his brother. The one person he'd counted on through every storm, "We can't be tied to you anymore. Don't reach out." The phone slipped from his hand, clattering onto the table. And he stared at his reflection in the one-way mirror. The man looking back was a stranger, pale, hollow-eyed, a shell of the swaggering cop who'd once owned every room he walked into. That man had power, certainty, a future. This man had nothing. Later, in the dim glow of his apartment, Travis slumped on the sagging couch. The weight of his body sinking into the cushions like it might swallow him whole. The television flickered, casting jagged shadows across the peeling walls. The voices of news anchors droning on about his disgrace. Travis Holt, once a decorated officer, now the face of police corruption, the words blurred into noise, a relentless hum he couldn't escape. His face was everywhere, plastered across screens, plastered with labels, brutal, arrogant, a disgrace. The footage played on a loop in his mind, him standing in that courtroom, arms crossed. Smirking as he kicked the governor of Georgia to the floor, his voice snarling, "Get the hell out of that seat, lady, this ain't for your kind." He'd said it without a second thought. The power coursing through him like a drug, blinding him to the cameras, the witnesses, the consequences. Now, that moment defined him, a single, reckless act that had toppled his empire. The phone buzzed incessantly at first, a lifeline he'd clung to, hoping for support. Reporters hounded him for quotes, their voices sharp and eager, old friends texted hasty goodbyes. Their loyalty evaporating as the scandal grew. Now, the calls had slowed, the messages trickling to nothing but echoes from a life he no longer owned. His family, his parents, his sister, had gone quiet, their silence a louder betrayal than any words. Even his captain, a gruff man who'd once called him one of the good ones, had vanished. Leaving only a department statement condemning him to the wolves. A sharp knock jolted him, his heart slamming against his ribs, his hands clenching the armrest until his knuckles whitened. No one had come by in days, no neighbors, no colleagues, no one brave enough to face the pariah he'd become. He didn't move, didn't breathe, waiting for the sound to fade. It didn't. Another knock. Louder, insistent, a harbinger of the justice he'd evaded for so long. This was the lesson, raw and unyielding: power, when abused, didn't just crumble, it devoured. Travis had wielded his authority like a weapon, believing the system would always catch him when he fell. But justice, though slow, was merciless. Stripping him bare and leaving him to face the wreckage alone. The consequences weren't just headlines or a lost badge, they were the empty apartment, the unanswered calls. The brother who'd turned away. For the first time, Travis understood the cost, not just to himself, but to the lives he'd trampled in his climb. And as the knocking grew louder, he knew there was no running from it anymore. The sharp, insistent rap on the door shattered the fragile stillness of Travis Holt's apartment, pulling him out of the haze he'd been drowning in. He sat there, rigid as stone, his breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat, willing the noise to vanish into the ether. Maybe if he stayed silent, whoever it was would give up. Turn around, and leave him to stew in the wreckage of his life. But the knock came again, louder this time, more demanding, like a fist pounding against the last threads of his composure. Something deep in his gut twisted, a quiet whisper telling him this wasn't someone he could brush off with silence. His mouth felt like it was lined with sand. Every swallow a gritty effort as he dragged himself to his feet. Each step toward the door was a battle, his body sluggish, as though he were wading through a swamp. The weight of his own existence pulling him down. His hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling slightly, a fleeting hesitation gripping him before he forced himself to twist it. The door creaked open with a slow, reluctant groan, and the air rushed out of him in a single, ragged gasp when he saw her. Monique Thompson stood there, just beyond the threshold. Her silhouette framed by the dim glow of the hallway light. She was a vision of calm, her posture straight and deliberate, but her face, unreadable as it was, carried a storm beneath the surface. The space around her crackled with something unspoken, something heavy and tense that made his skin prickle. There were no guards at her side, no swarm of reporters with flashing cameras. No lawyers poised to deliver another crushing blow. She was alone, and that solitude felt more menacing than any entourage could have. He'd imagined her as untouchable. A figure forever out of reach after the chaos he'd unleashed, yet here she was, standing on his doorstep, her dark eyes locking with his in a way that suggested she'd come for more than just answers. Up close, stripped of the courtroom's harsh lights and the media's relentless gaze, he could see the toll it had taken on her. Her face, though composed, bore faint shadows under her eyes. A quiet exhaustion etched into the lines around her mouth. This wasn't just about him, he realized, it never had been. She carried a burden far greater than his downfall. A weight that stretched beyond the headlines and the trial. For a long, suffocating moment, they stood there, the silence between them thick and oppressive. Pressing against his chest until he could barely breathe. He knew he should speak, should demand to know why she'd come, why she'd tracked him down when she'd already stripped him bare, his career. His pride, his life, but the words lodged in his throat. Deep down, in a corner of his soul he'd spent years ignoring. He understood that whatever she was about to say would cut deeper than any accusation he'd faced. She broke the stillness first, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. Steady yet laced with something complex, neither fury nor pity, but a shadowed emotion that lingered in the space between. I wasn't sure you'd open the door. Her words hung there, simple but loaded. And he let out a sharp breath, dragging a hand down his face as if he could wipe away the mess he'd become. Didn't think you'd ever want to see me again, he rasped. His voice sounding foreign to his own ears, worn thin and brittle. Monique studied him, her gaze piercing yet measured, before she gave a slight nod. I don't. The bluntness of it hit him like a punch, sharper than he'd expected, but he didn't recoil. How could he? She had every right to despise him. Every reason to want him buried beneath the consequences of his actions. And yet, here she was, stepping closer, the faint light casting jagged shadows across her face as she spoke again. But I needed to ask you something. Travis let out a hollow laugh, a bitter sound that echoed off the peeling walls of his apartment. He shook his head, glancing down at the scuffed floorboards before meeting her eyes again. You came all this way just to ask me something? Could have saved yourself the trip, my lawyers already got the final nail ready for the coffin. Monique didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Do you regret it? The question landed like a sledgehammer. Simple yet seismic, reverberating through his chest. His jaw tightened, his mind spinning as he scrambled for an answer that wouldn't feel like a lie. Did he regret it? The venom he'd spat. The power he'd wielded like a weapon, the arrogance that had fueled him, or did he only regret that this time, it had cost him everything? He opened his mouth, then shut it. The air escaping him in a jagged huff. I don't know. Her expression didn't waver, but her eyes sharpened, cutting through the haze of his uncertainty. That's not good enough. Travis exhaled again, the sound more a groan than a breath, his hand raking through his hair until his fingers gripped the back of his neck. He forced himself to look at her, really look at her. And the weight of her presence pressed down harder. "What do you want me to say?" he muttered, his voice cracking. "The truth?" Another bitter chuckle scraped its way out of him, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "The truth is, I didn't think. I didn't stop. I didn't hesitate." And now, his voice dropped, barely above a whisper. As if the confession were meant more for himself than for her. "Now I don't even know who I am anymore." The silence that followed was a living thing, thick and choking, wrapping around them both. Monique drew in a slow breath, crossing her arms as she regarded him with an intensity that bordered on disappointment, a look that stung more than any shout could have. "Do you know how many people have stood in front of me, telling me they regret what they did, but only after they've lost it all?" Her voice was soft, but each word carried the force of a judge's gavel. "It's always the same." Travis's jaw clenched, a flicker of defiance sparking in his chest. "You think I'm just like them?" She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Aren't you?" Something inside him fractured, a hairline crack splitting through the armor he'd worn for years. He wanted to argue. To shout that he wasn't like the others, that he wasn't some caricature of a villain, that he hadn't meant for things to spiral so far out of control. But the denial tasted sour. Crumbling before it could even form. Monique watched him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for a shred of something redeemable. Finally, she exhaled. A faint sound that carried the weight of her exhaustion. "I wanted to see if you were worth forgiving." His chest seized, his breath shallow and ragged, his voice scraping out hoarse and broken. "And?" She studied him for what felt like forever, her silence stretching into an abyss, before she shook her head. "I don't know yet." Then she turned, her footsteps echoing faintly as she walked away. Leaving him standing in the doorway, the cold air seeping in through the crack she'd left behind. Travis didn't call after her. He didn't move. He didn't try to justify the wreckage of his choices. For the first time, he wasn't sure there was anything left to defend. He stayed there, rooted in the silence of his apartment, long after her shadow had disappeared down the hall. The door hung slightly ajar, a sliver of the outside world creeping in, as if mocking his hope that she might turn back, might offer him some scrap of closure. But she didn't. She'd left him with nothing but her question, a ghost that lingered in the air, haunting him. Did he regret it? He'd wanted to lie, to weave some flimsy excuse that could paint over the ugliness. Make it fade into the background like a scandal that time would eventually erase. But the truth stared back at him, unblinking and merciless, suffocating him with its clarity. He shuffled back into the living room, the dim flicker of the television casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The same headline scrolled across the screen. A relentless loop of his disgrace, his name now a synonym for corruption, for everything rotten in the system he'd once sworn to uphold. He collapsed onto the couch. The springs creaking under his weight, and pressed his palms against his temples, trying to knead away the exhaustion that had settled into his bones. His badge was gone. Confiscated like a child's toy he'd misused. His career, a smoking ruin. His reputation, shredded beyond repair. Even the people he'd called friends had vanished. Scattering like rats from a sinking ship, while his family, once so proud of the Holt name, kept their distance, their shame a palpable thing he could feel through every unanswered call. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, a harsh vibration that jolted him from his thoughts. He stared at it, his hand hovering over the screen. Dread pooling in his stomach as he saw the name flashing, Dad. His father, a man carved from granite, had spent decades drilling lessons into him: stand tall, never yield, show no weakness. A cop himself, he'd handed Travis a playbook for life. Control was king, authority was everything, power was something you seized and held tight. Travis had lived by those rules. Building his career on that foundation, believing it made him untouchable. Now, with his world in ashes, he wondered if those lessons had been the architect of his ruin. He swallowed hard. His throat raw, and answered. "Dad," he croaked, the word barely audible. The pause on the other end stretched out, long and icy, the kind that made his skin crawl. When his father finally spoke. His voice was low, sharp as a blade. "What the hell were you thinking?" Travis's grip tightened on the phone, his knuckles whitening. "I wasn't," he admitted. The confession slipping out like a breath he'd been holding too long. "You think that's an excuse?" his father snapped, his tone colder than Travis had ever heard it. A frost that seeped through the line and into his chest. "You think you can just say, 'I wasn't thinking,' and that fixes this?" Travis didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of his father's disappointment, Monique's piercing question, and the relentless truth of his own actions pressed down on him, a crushing reminder of justice's unforgiving hand. Power. He'd learned too late, wasn't a shield, it was a chain, and he'd forged every link himself. As the silence stretched on, he realized this was the real consequence. Not just the loss of everything he'd built, but the stark, unshakable mirror held up to the man he'd become. And in that reflection, he saw a stranger, one he wasn't sure he could ever forgive. Travis Holt stood alone in the dim glow of his apartment, the blinds slanted just enough to let slivers of streetlight carve jagged lines across the worn hardwood floor. His breath came out in a sharp, ragged burst as he dragged a trembling hand down his face, the stubble scraping against his palm like sandpaper. "I know that," he muttered, his voice low and frayed. Barely holding together under the weight of everything he'd lost. His father's response cut through the air like a blade, cold and unyielding. "No, you don't. You don't have a damn clue, Travis. This isn't something you can crawl back from. This isn't one of those quiet little department hush-ups where they pat you on the back, send you off to some sleepy precinct, and call it a day. You're finished. Done. Do you even realize what people are saying about you out there?" Travis let out a laugh, bitter and hollow. The sound bouncing off the peeling walls of his cramped living space. He shook his head, his dark hair falling into his eyes, unkempt and wild from days of neglect. "Yeah, Dad, I've seen it. I've watched every channel, scrolled through every post, heard every whisper. I know exactly what they're saying." His father's voice hardened, pressing down on him like a vice. "Then tell me something, Travis. Do you regret it?" The question landed like a punch to the gut, stopping him cold. His heart slammed against his ribcage. Each beat a deafening thud that threatened to split him open. It was the same question that had haunted him for years, lurking in the shadows of his mind. One he'd convinced himself he'd never have to face. He'd built his life on the belief that he was untouchable, that his badge was a shield no one could pierce, that consequences were for other people. But now, standing in the ruins of everything he'd once been, that question was all he had left. His throat tightened, words strangling themselves before they could escape. "I don't know." He finally choked out, the admission tasting like ash on his tongue. The silence that followed was suffocating, a thick fog rolling across the phone line, pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. His father exhaled slowly, a sound heavy with disappointment, and when he spoke again, his tone was quieter but sharp enough to slice through bone. "Then you're in deeper trouble than I thought, son." Travis squeezed his eyes shut, a tremor running through him as something raw and jagged clawed at his chest, threatening to unravel him completely. "Dad, don't," he started, but his father cut him off, his voice rising like a storm. "You embarrassed me, Travis. You dragged this family through the mud. I don't care what kind of man you think you are right now, you're nothing. You hear me? Nothing." The words hit harder than any screaming headline, sharper than the venom spat at him on the news. More brutal than anything Monique Thompson had ever thrown his way. Travis's breath hitched, his fingers curling into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. His father had never spoken to him like this, not in all the years he'd worn the uniform, not in all the moments he'd stood tall under the weight of that badge. Maybe it's better this way. His father continued, his voice dripping with a bitter edge, almost like disgust. Maybe you needed this. Maybe you finally had to feel what it's like to be on the other side of that power you loved so much. Before Travis could muster a response, the line went dead, the silence swallowing him whole. He stared at the phone in his shaking hands, the screen blurring as the world around him seemed to collapse inward. The walls of his apartment loomed closer, the air growing thick and oppressive. For the first time in his life, he felt small, stripped bare, powerless. Then came the buzz, a sharp, insistent vibration that jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. Another message. He wasn't sure why he even bothered to look. Maybe some desperate, pitiful part of him still clung to the hope that someone out there might offer him a lifeline. A shred of kindness amidst the storm of rage and disdain. But when he opened the text, his stomach twisted into a knot. From an unknown number, the words glowed stark and menacing. You should watch your back, his breath caught in his throat, his eyes darting to the window. Through the slats of the blinds, he saw it, a black car parked across the street. Its sleek frame glinting under the sodium glow of a street lamp. Panic surged through him, a cold wave that drowned out the dull ache of his ruined career. This wasn't just about losing his job anymore, his badge, his name. This was about survival. He wasn't a cop now, not a figure of authority cloaked in protection. He was just a man who'd made too many enemies, who'd left too many scars. And those enemies were out there, their eyes fixed on him, waiting. Days earlier, Travis Holt had never imagined his life could crumble like this. He sat slouched on his threadbare couch, the television humming faintly in the background. Its drone a constant companion he barely registered. The apartment was a tomb, its shadows stretching long and deep, the air stale with the scent of unwashed dishes and regret. He'd lost everything, his job, his pension, the respect that came with his title, but the real loss was something less tangible, something he'd only just begun to grasp. The illusion that he was invincible. It had crept up on him slowly at first, a quiet unraveling he hadn't wanted to see. The phone calls that went unanswered. The colleagues who'd once clapped him on the back now vanishing into thin air, their loyalty dissolving the moment his disgrace stained the headlines. Now, though, it was impossible to ignore. The consequences weren't distant rumors anymore, they were here, pressing against his chest, wrapping around his throat. That text message gnawed at him, its words looping endlessly in his mind. You should watch your back. For years, he'd walked through the world believing power was his armor, that his authority kept him safe. But now, stripped of that shield, he was exposed. Vulnerable in a way he'd never known. He'd built his career on control, on the unshakable conviction that fear was a weapon he could wield, that justice was his to define. Now, that same fear turned against him, slinking into his bones like a thief. He hadn't left the apartment in days, and when he did, he moved like a shadow of himself. Gone was the swagger that had once defined him, the bold stride that announced his presence in every room. Now, each step was tentative, uncertain. As if the ground beneath him might crack and swallow him whole. Outside, the city buzzed on, indifferent to his fall. He could feel it in the way people stared, those fleeting, piercing glances that lingered too long, their faces a mix of revulsion and apathy. Some looked at him like he was a monster, others like he was nothing at all, and somehow, that indifference cut deeper. His name had become a cautionary tale, a hushed murmur passed between strangers, Travis Holt, the cop who went too far, and then there was Monique Thompson. She hadn't said a word about him publicly since that night she'd confronted him at his doorstep, her voice steady and her eyes blazing with a fire he couldn't match. She didn't need to. The world had already judged him, and she had bigger fights to wage. He'd watched her from afar, though, seen how she carried herself through the chaos. How she'd taken the wreckage of his actions and forged it into something greater. She'd pushed for new laws, cracked down on the kind of misconduct he'd embodied. Turned his downfall into a rallying cry for change. She hadn't just let the system chew him up and spit him out, she'd made it answer for him. And in her strength, he saw something he'd never understood before, not power, not control, but something truer, integrity. His father's words echoed in his skull, "You're nothing." Maybe he was right. But maybe, just maybe, that emptiness was the only way Travis could finally see the cost of what he'd done. The threats didn't stop, texts, shadowed cars. Footsteps that lingered too long outside his building, but the fear began to fade, replaced by a dull, persistent ache. He had no allies left, no future to cling to, but he still had a choice. He could vanish into the void, or he could face the truth. For the first time, he chose the latter, not out of pride or desperation, but out of something new, something fragile, accountability. It started small, a quiet step into the unknown. He wrote a statement, no grand press conference, no polished PR spin, just raw, unvarnished words. "What I did was wrong," he typed. His fingers trembling over the keys. "There's no excuse. I abused my position, and I have to live with the consequences." He sent it out into the world, and the response was a whisper, barely a ripple. He'd fallen too far to matter anymore, the outrage had moved on, the spotlight shifted. But that wasn't the point. For once, he wasn't running. Then came the harder part. He reached out to the people he'd dismissed for years, activists, organizers, voices he'd once sneered at as troublemakers. He sat in cramped community centers, the air thick with tension. Facing men and women whose lives had been shattered by officers like him. At first, he said nothing, his tongue heavy with shame. What could he say to a mother who'd lost her son? To a brother whose sister had been broken by the system he'd served? But he showed up, day after day, and he listened. Their stories poured over him like a flood, grief, anger, resilience, and slowly, painfully, he began to see the breadth of the damage he'd left behind. Not just to Monique, not just to himself, but to every soul who'd ever trembled under the shadow of his badge. Justice, he realized, wasn't the gavel he'd swung so carelessly. It was this, the slow, messy work of facing what he'd broken, of understanding the lives he'd upended. The lesson sank deep. Power without restraint was a poison, and he'd drunk it willingly, believing it made him untouchable. Now, as the hunted instead of the hunter, he saw the other side. And in that seeing, he found something he'd never had before, not redemption, not yet, but the faint flicker of a man who might one day be more than nothing. The air hung heavy with the scent of polished mahogany and rich, buttery leather as Jamal pushed through the glass doors of the upscale boutique. His sneakers let out a faint squeak against the gleaming tiles, a sound quickly swallowed by the low murmur of hushed voices and the smooth, velvety notes of jazz drifting from unseen speakers. For a moment, he froze just inside the threshold, his breath catching in his chest as his eyes swept over the opulent space. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across rows of glass cases. Each one cradling treasures, watches with intricate faces, jewelry that glittered like captured stars, accessories that whispered wealth in a language Jamal had never learned to speak. He tugged nervously at the frayed hem of his hoodie, his fingertips brushing the thick envelope of cash tucked into his pocket. This wasn't his world. And he felt the weight of that truth pressing down on every inch of him. But he squared his shoulders, determination flickering like a stubborn flame in his chest. His mom's birthday was coming. And after months of late-night shifts and skipped meals to save every dime, he was here to get her something worthy of the woman who'd raised him single-handedly, a gift as close to her value as his hard-earned money could reach. Across the room, a middle-aged saleswoman stood behind the counter, her crisp white blouse and tailored pencil skirt as pristine as the store itself. She glanced up at Jamal. Her lips curving into a smile so tight it barely touched her face, let alone her eyes. The gesture was fleeting, she dropped her gaze back to the tablet in her hands almost instantly. As if dismissing him before he'd even spoken. Jamal swallowed the lump in his throat and stepped toward a display of watches, his eyes locking onto a delicate silver piece. Its mother-of-pearl face shimmered under the light, soft and elegant, just like his mom. He could already picture her face lighting up, her calloused hands trembling as she opened the box. Perfect. He murmured under his breath, leaning closer, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and anticipation. Before he could even reach out, a voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Can I help you?" Jamal turned to find a man in a tailored navy suit standing a few feet away, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The man's face was a mask, unreadable, but radiating a chill that made Jamal's stomach twist. "Oh, I was just looking at this watch," Jamal said, gesturing toward the display with a shaky hand. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Those are quite expensive," he replied, his tone sharp and deliberate, each word laced with unspoken doubt. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Jamal blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Yeah, I'm sure," he said, forcing his voice to steady. "I'm here to buy a gift for my mom." The man's gaze slid over him slowly, taking in the faded hoodie, the worn jeans, the scuffed sneakers. "Right," he drawled, the word dripping with skepticism. "Well, let me know if you need anything." He didn't move, though, his eyes lingered, cold and unyielding, pinning Jamal in place. Jamal tried to shake off the unease creeping up his spine as he moved to another display. His palms were slick with sweat now, his fingers trembling slightly as he wiped them on his jeans. He hadn't done anything wrong, why did it feel like he was already guilty? He bent to examine another watch, its gold hands ticking silently behind the glass, when a second voice cut in. "Can I see your hands, please?" This time, it was a younger employee, his tone clipped and impatient as he approached from the far side of the store. Jamal frowned, straightening up. "What?" The man nodded toward Jamal's pockets. "Your hands. We need to make sure you're not concealing anything." Heat surged to Jamal's face, a mix of embarrassment and indignation burning in his cheeks. "I didn't take anything," he said, his voice tight. "I'm just looking." The younger man's lips twitched into a faint smirk. "Then you won't mind showing your hands. Are you serious right now?" Jamal's voice cracked, disbelief warring with the anger bubbling inside him. He yanked his hands from his hoodie pocket and held them up, palms open and empty. The younger employee's smirk widened. As if Jamal's frustration only proved some silent point. "We've had incidents before," he said, his tone almost casual, like an afterthought. Jamal's throat tightened, his breath coming faster. "You mean shoplifting? You think I'm trying to steal something?" The man raised a hand, his expression hardening. "Calm down. We're just doing our job." By now, the store's quiet hum had shifted. Customers were glancing over, their curiosity prickling the air. A woman in a tailored blazer leaned toward her companion, whispering something behind her hand. The companion, a man with salt and pepper hair, shot Jamal a quick, disapproving look before shaking his head. Jamal felt the walls closing in, the weight of their stares pressing against his ribs. "I don't want any trouble," he muttered, stepping back from the display. "I just wanted to buy something." The older man in the suit reappeared, his voice smooth but firm. "Sir, we take security very seriously here. If you don't intend to purchase anything, I'll have to ask you to leave." "I do want to buy something," Jamal snapped, his frustration spilling over. He gestured toward the silver watch. "That one. I want to buy it." The man's eyebrow arched, skepticism etched into every line of his face. That's a $2,500 piece. Jamal's jaw tightened. I know, he said, pulling the envelope from his pocket with a trembling hand. I have the money right here. The man's eyes flicked to the cash, but his expression didn't soften. Instead, he exchanged a quick, knowing glance with the younger employee. This is ridiculous, Jamal said, his voice shaking with a mix of fury and humiliation. I didn't do anything wrong. Sir. The older man cut in, his tone now edged with steel. If you continue raising your voice, I'll have no choice but to call the authorities. Jamal froze. The word authorities echoing in his ears like a gunshot. I'm calling now, the younger employee added, already reaching for his phone. Wait, what? Jamal stepped forward. His hands raised in a desperate plea. You don't have to do that. Please, I didn't do anything. The commotion swelled, drawing more eyes. Shoppers craned their necks. Their murmurs floating through the air like venom. Why would he even come in here dressed like that? Probably up to no good. Shameful. Tears stung Jamal's eyes, hot and insistent. But he clenched his jaw, refusing to let them fall. He'd done nothing wrong, nothing. Minutes later, the glass doors swung open again, and two police officers strode in. Their heavy boots thudding against the tiles. The crowd's whispers fell silent, the air thick with tension. What's the situation? One officer asked, his voice clipped and professional. The older man in the suit stepped forward, his demeanor calm and polished. This young man was behaving suspiciously around our merchandise. He's been asked to leave multiple times but refuses. That's not true. Jamal protested, his voice cracking with desperation. I was just looking. The officer turned to him, his face neutral but unyielding. Son, do you have any ID on you? Jamal hesitated, his heart pounding. I didn't bring my wallet. The older man muttered under his breath, convenient. Jamal's head snapped toward him. What's that supposed to mean? Let's take this outside, the officer said, placing a firm hand on Jamal's shoulder. Jamal flinched, his chest tightening until he could barely breathe. Please, he whispered. His voice breaking, I just wanted to buy a gift for my mom. Before the officer could respond, a new voice boomed across the store, deep and commanding. Sir. Every head turned toward the entrance. Where a tall, sharply dressed man stormed in, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with purpose. Christopher, Jamal's father, strode forward, his face a storm of barely contained rage. What's going on here? The older man in the suit blinked, momentarily thrown. Are you with him? I'm his father, Christopher said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the tension like a knife. And you'd better have a damn good explanation for why my son is surrounded by cops. The room shifted, the air crackling with a new energy. The officers hesitated. Their confidence wavering as they studied Christopher more closely. Wait a minute, one murmured, recognition dawning. But Christopher ignored them, his focus narrowing to his son. Jamal, he said. His voice softening, though it still carried an edge of steel. Are you okay? Jamal's resolve crumbled. Tears streamed down his face as he shook his head. I didn't do anything, Dad. I swear. Christopher's jaw tightened as he turned back to the employees. I'm going to need an explanation. Now. The silence that followed was deafening, every eye in the store locked on Christopher. He stood tall, unyielding, his presence filling the room as he stared down the men who dared to judge his son. And in that moment, the balance of power began to tip. Meanwhile, miles away, Travis Holt sat slumped in a dimly lit room, the weight of his past pressing down on him like a physical force. For years, he'd worn his badge like armor, a shield that made him untouchable. A king in a world where power was law. He'd bent rules, broken spirits, and silenced voices, all under the guise of justice. But now, stripped of that badge, he was just a man, raw and exposed. The memory of Monique Thompson haunted him, not her fear, but her defiance. She'd stood before him, bloodied but unbroken, her eyes burning with a fire he couldn't extinguish. He'd thought power was his birthright, that fear was the same as respect. He'd been wrong. Monique, on the other hand, had risen from that dark night stronger than ever. The attack hadn't shattered her, it had forged her into something unbreakable. Her policies passed, her work flourished, and though she never spoke Travis's name aloud, it lingered in the air like a shadow. To the world, he became a cautionary tale, a living lesson etched into the fabric of her triumph. Justice had caught him, not with fanfare or redemption, but with the quiet, relentless force of consequences. And as Travis sat there, alone with his thoughts, he wondered if it would ever be enough. Forgiveness wasn't coming, probably never would, but for the first time, he wasn't hiding. Maybe that meant something. Maybe it didn't. The real lesson, though, stretched far beyond Travis or Monique. It was carved into the cracks of their story. Power, when left unchecked, festers into abuse. Fear can never masquerade as respect. And when the world finally holds you accountable, no badge, no name, no system can shield you from the fallout. Justice isn't always punishment or redemption, it's the raw, unyielding truth of consequences. A mirror held up to those who once thought themselves untouchable. And in that truth lies its power, a force that echoes through every life it touches, demanding we all reckon with what it truly means. The air in the upscale boutique felt thick with tension as Jamal Banks stood rooted to the spot. His slim frame quivering like a leaf caught in a storm. His hands, shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie, clenched into fists, not out of anger, but out of a desperate attempt to hold himself together. Relief washed over him in waves when his father, Christopher Banks, stormed through the glass doors. His presence commanding the room like a tidal wave crashing against a fragile shore. Jamal's wide eyes flickered toward his father, gratitude mingling with the shame that gnawed at his insides. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, trembling under the weight of accusing stares. Christopher's voice sliced through the stifling atmosphere. Steady as a blade but edged with a sharpness that made the store employees flinch. "Let me get this perfectly clear," he began, his tone deceptively calm as he squared his broad shoulders. "You're telling me my son, my 16-year-old son, is a thief?" His dark eyes narrowed, pinning the older employee, a wiry man with thinning hair and a too-tight tie, who shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. The man's fingers fidgeted with his collar, tugging at it as if it were strangling him, his earlier bravado crumbling like dry sand. "Sir," he stammered, his voice thin and placating, "it's not personal. We've had thefts before, incidents that require us to follow certain protocols." "Protocols," Christopher echoed, the word dripping from his lips like venom. He took a step closer, his polished shoes clicking ominously against the marble floor. "And tell me, do these protocols of yours include dragging a young man through the mud just because of the way he looks?" His gaze swung to the younger employee, a lanky kid barely out of his teens, whose Adam's apple bobbed as he tried to speak. "Mister," the boy started, but the word died in his throat when Christopher's piercing stare locked onto him. "Banks," Christopher finished for him, his voice smooth but unyielding. "Christopher Banks. I'm guessing you've caught one or two of my films?" Recognition sparked in the young employee's eyes, his jaw dropping slightly as the weight of the name sank in. He'd seen this man on the big screen, larger than life, commanding armies and toppling empires. And now, here he was, radiating the same intensity in a quiet store on a Thursday afternoon. The boy's mouth worked soundlessly, and Christopher folded his arms across his chest, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Yeah. I thought so. But this isn't about me. Let's talk about my son, a paying customer who walked in here with cash in his pocket to buy his mother a gift, only to find himself surrounded by cops. Explain that to me. The police officer who'd been hovering near Jamal shuffled forward, his boots scuffing the floor as he raised a cautious hand. His badge gleamed under the store's bright lights. A silent reminder of the authority he wielded, or thought he did. Mr. Banks, he said, his tone measured but tinged with unease, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We were called because. Because what? Christopher cut in, his voice rising just enough to make the officer flinch. Because someone decided my son didn't belong here? Because he wasn't strutting around in a three-piece suit or flashing a platinum card? Tell me, officer. Did it cross your mind to ask these fine gentlemen why they pegged a teenage boy as a criminal before you swooped in to cuff him? The officer's jaw tightened. His weight shifting from one foot to the other as he struggled to find an answer. His partner, a stocky woman with a stern face, stood silently behind him. Her eyes darting between her colleague and the furious father. She wasn't about to step into the line of fire, not yet. Christopher's gaze snapped back to the older employee. His voice cracking like a whip through the silence. And what exactly about my son screamed criminal to you? His skin? His hoodie? What was it? The question hung in the air, heavy and accusing. As the employees exchanged uneasy glances. The older man cleared his throat, a raspy sound that grated against the quiet murmurs of the gathering crowd. Mr. Banks, he said. His tone oily with forced politeness, we're a high-end establishment. It's not uncommon for us to keep a close eye on customers. Unfortunately, some individuals. Some individuals? Christopher's interruption was sharp, his eyes blazing with barely contained fury. You mean young black boys like my son? Is that what you're dancing around? The man's face flushed a deep crimson. His hands fluttering in protest. No, of course not, he sputtered, beads of sweat dotting his forehead. We don't discriminate, we have policies. Policies that somehow only seem to apply to people who look like Jamal, Christopher shot back, his voice cold as steel. He tilted his head, studying the man with a look that could have frozen water. Tell me something, did you shadow every customer who strolled in here today? The guy in the pinstripe suit by the watches? The lady with the $1,000 purse? Or was it just the kid in sneakers who caught your eagle eye? Jamal stood silent beside his father, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The weight of every stare, employees, officers, curious shoppers, pressed down on him like a physical force. A lump swelled in his chest, threatening to choke him as whispers rippled through the crowd. It's so dramatic. A woman in a sleek coat muttered to her friend, her voice carrying just far enough to reach Jamal's ears. If the boy's innocent, why'd they call the police? The word stung like a slap. And Jamal's head jerked toward her, his voice cracking as he forced it out. I didn't steal anything, he said, the tremor in his tone betraying the tears he was fighting to hold back. I was just trying to buy a watch for my mom. The woman blinked, startled by his outburst, but offered no reply, her lips pressing into a thin line as she turned away. Christopher's hand landed on Jamal's shoulder, warm and steady, grounding him in the chaos. You don't owe her an explanation, son, he said, his voice softening for the first time. He turned back to the employees, his expression hardening once more. This ends right now. The humiliation you've put my boy through, it stops here. The older employee straightened, his discomfort giving way to a flicker of defiance. He adjusted his tie again, as if it could shield him from Christopher's wrath. Sir, he said, his voice tight, I assure you. We didn't intend to humiliate anyone. Our job is to protect our merchandise. And your merchandise needed protecting from my son? Christopher's tone was laced with biting sarcasm. Not from the businessmen over there fingering the cufflinks, or the woman browsing the diamond necklaces, just from the 16-year-old who dared to walk through your doors. The younger employee stepped forward, his face pale and his voice strained. Sir, if you're implying we discriminated against your son. I'm not implying anything, Christopher snapped. His words cutting through the air like a blade. I'm stating it plain and simple, this whole mess is the result of your prejudice, and I'm going to make damn sure the world knows it. The younger employee's shoulders slumped, his bravado evaporating as the gravity of the situation sank in. Mr. Banks, please, he pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. Let's not blow this out of proportion. Blow this out of proportion? Christopher repeated, his voice rising to a dangerous pitch. He took a step closer, towering over the young man, who shrank back instinctively. You called the police on a child. You humiliated him in front of a store full of strangers. And now you want to brush it under the rug because you've figured out who I am? No chance. Jamal, finding his courage at last, stepped forward, his voice small but firm. They didn't even let me explain, Dad. They just assumed I was stealing. Christopher's face softened as he turned to his son, a pang of sorrow flashing in his eyes. I know, Jamal, he said quietly. And they're going to pay for that. The younger employee whirled toward the officers, desperation etched into every line of his face. Officers, surely we can sort this out. Mr. Banks doesn't need to. Oh, I'm involving everyone, Christopher interjected, his voice low and lethal. The media, social justice groups, my lawyers, you name it. This isn't going away. The officers exchanged a wary glance, the woman finally stepping forward, her tone clipped. Mr. Banks, if you'd like to file a formal complaint. I'll be filing more than a complaint. Christopher cut her off, his eyes blazing. I'll make sure every news outlet from here to California hears about this. The older employee edged closer, lowering his voice as if it could soften the blow. Mr. Banks, perhaps we could settle this privately? No need to turn it into a spectacle. Christopher's laugh was sharp and humorless, echoing off the polished walls. A spectacle? You turned this into a spectacle the second you called the cops on my son for daring to exist in your precious store. Don't you dare tell me not to make a scene. Jamal tugged at his father's sleeve, his voice barely audible. Dad, can we just go? I don't want to be here anymore. Christopher froze, his anger faltering as he looked down at his son's pleading eyes. The fire in his chest dimmed, replaced by a deep ache. You don't deserve any of this, he said softly, his hand resting on Jamal's shoulder. None of this is your fault. I know, Jamal whispered, his gaze dropping to the floor. I just want to leave. Christopher nodded, his jaw tight. But his eyes never left the employees. We're going, he said, his voice a low growl. But don't think for a second this is over. As he guided Jamal toward the exit, the male officer called after him, his tone tentative. Mr. Banks, we'll file a report if you need to contact us. I won't need to, Christopher replied without turning back, his words carrying a promise. Trust me, the whole world's going to hear about this. Outside, the sunlight hit Jamal like a slap, harsh and unrelenting against the cold knot of shame twisting in his gut. The whispers of the crowd followed them, a buzzing swarm he couldn't shake. He kept his eyes glued to the pavement, his sneakers scuffing against the concrete as tears burned behind his lids. Christopher stopped and knelt in front of him, his strong hands gripping Jamal's shoulders. Jamal, he said. His voice steady and warm, "I'm proud of you. You hear me? None of this is on you. Don't let them make you feel small." Jamal nodded, but the dam broke, tears spilling down his cheeks. "I just wanted to do something nice for Mom," he choked out, his voice raw. Christopher pulled him into a fierce hug, his arms a fortress against the world. "I know, son," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "And you did. You stood tall. That's more than they'll ever manage." By nightfall, the incident had exploded online. A shaky video captured by a bystander's phone lighting up screens across the country. Hashtags like #JusticeForJamal and #racial profiling surged through social media, trending by dawn. Christopher's phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters, each one clamoring for a piece of the story. At the breakfast table, Jamal sat hunched over his cereal, scrolling through the flood of posts on his phone. "Dad, it's everywhere," he said quietly, his thumb pausing on a particularly heated comment. He hesitated, then added, "Do we have to keep talking about it?" Christopher set his coffee down and leaned forward, his expression grave but gentle. "I know it's a lot, Jamal. But this isn't just about us anymore. People are watching, they're listening. This is our shot to show them what's broken and push for something better." Jamal fidgeted with the frayed edge of his hoodie, his brow furrowing. "I didn't ask for this," he mumbled, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "I know," Christopher said, softer now. "But sometimes the fight picks us, whether we're ready or not." The doorbell's sharp chime cut through the moment, and Christopher rose to answer it. He returned with a manila envelope, his lips pressing into a thin line. "They move fast," he muttered, dropping it onto the table. "What is it?" Jamal asked, peering at the envelope as if it might bite. "A legal notice from the store," Christopher replied, flipping it open. "An apology and a settlement offer, $25,000 to resolve this amicably." He held up the check, his scoff bitter. "As if a paycheck can erase what they did to you." Jamal's frown deepened, his fingers tightening around his spoon. The money felt like a bribe, a cheap plaster over a wound that ran far deeper than they could ever understand, a wound carved by injustice, sharpened by the abuse of power, and one that demanded more than silence in return. For Christopher, it was a call to arms, a lesson in holding the powerful accountable. For Jamal, it was a scar he'd carry, a reminder that even the smallest acts of good could be twisted by those too blind to see his worth. Christopher stood in the sleek, glass-walled high-rise office, staring out at the city skyline as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room. His chest swelled with a flicker of pride, not the kind that comes from arrogance, but the quiet, burning kind that fuels a man who knows the battle isn't over. "They think this is finished just because they cut a check," he muttered, his voice low but steady, reverberating with conviction. In his mind, the money was nothing more than a flimsy bandage slapped over a gaping wound. Real justice, the kind that mattered, wouldn't come until the entire rotten system crumbled and was rebuilt from the ground up. His eyes narrowed, glinting with determination as he turned to face Grace, his lawyer, who sat poised behind her desk, her sharp gaze fixed on her laptop screen. Grace was a force of nature, a civil rights warrior with over a decade of experience etched into the fine lines around her eyes. Her fingers danced across the keyboard with purpose, each tap a small declaration of war against the injustice they were unraveling. "The manager's background," she said, her tone clipped and triumphant, "it's a gold mine, Christopher. We've dug up photos from his college days, marches, rallies, the works. Let's just say they weren't exactly waving banners for equality." She leaned back, letting the weight of her discovery settle between them. Christopher edged closer, his curiosity piqued, his body tense with anticipation. "You're saying he was in a white supremacist group?" he asked, his voice rising slightly, hungry for the confirmation that would sharpen their case into a blade. Not officially, Grace replied, her lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. But these pictures? They don't leave much room for doubt about where his heart was. And it's not just him, employees are stepping out of the shadows, anonymously for now. Spilling stories about a culture of racial bias that runs deep in that store. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Christopher's mind raced, piecing together a vision far grander than a single payout. This wasn't just about his son, Jamal. Anymore, it was about every young soul who'd ever walked into a place like that and been stripped of their dignity, judged not for who they were but for the shade of their skin. "We're going to expose it all," he said, his voice resolute, a plan crystallizing in his thoughts. Grace's smile widened, a spark of admiration lighting her eyes. "That's why I love working with you, Christopher. You don't just fight, you dream big." Meanwhile, across town, Jamal slumped on the living room couch, the controller in his hands trembling slightly as he mashed buttons, trying to drown out the world with the frenetic chaos of a video game. The flashing lights and pounding music blared through the room. But they couldn't silence the relentless buzz of his phone, texts from classmates, DMs from strangers, even a gruff but heartfelt message from his basketball coach. Each ping felt like a tiny jolt, pulling him back to the moment that had turned his life upside down. His mom, Lena, stepped quietly into the room, her presence soft but grounding, like a lighthouse in a storm. She settled beside him, her eyes searching his face with a tenderness that made his chest ache. "Hey," she said gently, her voice a soothing balm against the noise in his head. "How you holding up?" Jamal shrugged, his shoulders hunching as he kept his gaze locked on the screen, afraid to meet her eyes and see the worry there. "Everyone keeps asking me that," he mumbled, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Lena reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and steady. "That's because they care about you," she said, her tone firm yet kind. "But it's okay if you don't have the words right now. It's a lot. Too much, maybe, for anyone, especially someone your age." Jamal sighed, his fingers pausing over the controller before he set it down, the game soundtrack fading into an empty hum. "I just feel like everything's different now," he admitted, his voice cracking. "People don't see me anymore. I'm just that kid from the video." Lena's grip tightened slightly, her resolve cutting through his doubt. "You're still you, Jamal," she said, her voice unwavering. "Don't let them steal that from you." He hesitated, his throat tightening as he wrestled with a question that had been gnawing at him. "Do you think Dad's right about making this bigger than just me?" Lena paused, her eyes softening as she chose her words carefully. "Your dad fights because he can't stand the thought of anyone else going through what you did. But if you're not ready to carry that flag, that's okay too. No one's asking you to be anyone but yourself." Her words wrapped around him like a warm embrace, easing the knot in his chest. He nodded, letting her reassurance settle over him, a fleeting comfort in the chaos. The following week, the air outside the courthouse buzzed with energy as Christopher stood tall amidst a sea of reporters, activists, and supporters clutching handmade signs that fluttered in the breeze. Jamal lingered at his side, his stomach churning as camera lenses swiveled toward him like unblinking eyes. Christopher's voice boomed through the crowd, steady and commanding, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "This isn't just about one boy in one store," he declared, his words ringing with a righteous fury. "This is about a system that sizes people up by the color of their skin before they even get a chance to speak. It's about a culture that's taught us some lives don't matter as much as others, and that ends now." The crowd erupted, a wave of applause crashing over them, but Jamal shifted on his feet, the weight of his father's conviction pressing down on him. He couldn't deny the fire in those words, but standing there, exposed and vulnerable, he felt more like a prop than a person. After the cameras dispersed, a journalist, a wiry man with a notepad and an eager grin, pushed through the throng toward Jamal. "Jamal, how does it feel to be the face of such a powerful movement?" The question hit him like a punch, and he froze, his mind scrambling for an answer he didn't have. Before he could stammer a response, Christopher stepped in, his presence a shield. "My son's strong," he said smoothly, his tone leaving no room for argument, "but he's also 16. Let's not forget he's still a kid trying to find his way in a world that should have done right by him." The journalist nodded, backing off, but Jamal's gut twisted with guilt. Strong? He didn't feel strong. He felt lost, adrift in a storm he hadn't asked for. That night, Christopher sat in his study. The glow of a desk lamp casting sharp shadows across his face as he pored over case files. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books, a sanctuary of focus amid the whirlwind. A soft knock broke his concentration, and he looked up to see Jamal hovering in the doorway, his hands fidgeting nervously. "Hey," Jamal said, his voice small. "Can we talk?" Christopher set his papers aside, his expression softening. "Always, son," he replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. Jamal took a deep breath, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm proud of you, Dad, what you're doing, it's amazing. But I don't think I'm like you. I don't know how to be brave like that." Christopher leaned forward, his eyes locking onto his son's with a quiet intensity. "Jamal, bravery isn't about standing on a stage or shouting into a microphone. It's about holding on to who you are when everything's trying to tear you down, and you've already done that." Jamal looked down, his throat tight, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. "It doesn't feel like enough," he whispered. "It is," Christopher said firmly, his voice a lifeline. "And if you ever want to do more, you'll find your way. But right now? Just be Jamal. That's more than enough." For the first time in days, a faint spark of relief flickered in Jamal's chest. "Thanks, Dad," he murmured, and Christopher's smile was warm and unwavering. "Always, son." The next morning, the news hit like a thunderclap. The store manager had resigned, his past racist ties laid bare for the world to see. Christopher's team wasted no time, issuing a statement that didn't just celebrate the victory but demanded more, calling for systemic change over fleeting accountability. The story exploded across the country, dominating morning talk shows and flooding social media with hashtags and heated debates. Jamal sat in front of the TV, watching the coverage unfold. His emotions a tangled mess, relief that the man was gone, anger at how long it had taken, pride in his father's unrelenting push, and a nagging confusion about where he fit into it all. But beneath the tumult, something new stirred, hope, fragile but real, a whisper that maybe things could get better. The fallout from that day in the store stretched far beyond the walls of their home, rippling through the community like a stone dropped in still water. At school, Jamal couldn't escape the whispers that trailed him down the halls. Some kids slapped his back like he was a hero, others sidestepped him as if his story might rub off on them. His history teacher, a wiry woman with a habit of over-enunciating, pulled him aside one afternoon. "Jamal, your essay on standing up for what's right, it was inspiring," she said, her voice dripping with rehearsed sincerity. Thanks," he replied, sinking into his chair as the bell rang, desperate to disappear. Outside, his best friend Marco jogged to catch up, his grin wide and teasing. "Man, you've got 'em all shook up," he laughed. "They think you're about to go live and call out the whole school." Jamal forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You good?" Marco asked, his tone softening. "I don't know," Jamal admitted. "Everyone's acting weird. I don't even know how to talk to them anymore." Marco nodded, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "They'll chill out eventually. Just ride it out. At home, Christopher's days blurred into a frenzy of meetings, calls, and late-night strategy sessions with Grace. The living room felt emptier without him, and Jamal flipped through channels aimlessly one evening until Lena sank onto the couch beside him. "Your dad's in the office again," she said with a small smile. "Trying to fix the world in one go, I think." Jamal sighed, the sound heavy. "Yeah, that's him." She studied him, her gaze gentle but piercing. "You've been quiet lately. Want to talk?" He shook his head, but her presence, steady, unspoken, eased the tension coiled in his chest. A week later, the store issued another statement. A glossy promise of change, mandatory bias training, a donation to a civil rights group, a diversity consultant on speed dial. Grace's voice crackled over the phone as she dissected it with Christopher. "Damage control," she said dryly. "They're scrambling to save face." "Good," Christopher shot back. "Let them squirm." But Jamal, reading the words on his phone, felt a hollow ache. It sounded nice, but it reeked of performance, like a script written to quiet the noise, not fix the problem. Over dinner. He glanced at his father. "Do you think they mean it?" Christopher's fork paused midair. "They mean it as much as they have to. Real change? That's bigger than a press release. That's why we don't stop." Jamal nodded, chewing on the thought, the taste of it bittersweet. One evening, as Christopher prepped for yet another TV spot, Jamal lingered by the study door. Watching his father shuffle notes. "Ready to be famous again?" he asked, his voice light but laced with something heavier. Christopher looked up, his smile tired but genuine. "This isn't about fame, son." "I know," Jamal said quickly, "but doesn't it ever wear you out? Fighting all the time?" Christopher leaned back, his chair creaking softly. "It does. But every inch we gain makes it harder for the next person to ignore what's broken." Jamal hesitated, then pressed on. "What happens when people stop caring?" Christopher's smile faded, his eyes growing distant. "That's the tough part. The world moves on. But we don't. Even when no one's watching, the fight's still ours." The words sank into Jamal, deep and unshakable. A lesson in justice and the cost of wielding power, or losing it. Days later, Marco dragged Jamal to the mall, sneakers on the agenda despite Jamal's reluctance. The air felt thick as they passed the store, its windows gleaming with a false sheen of renewal. Jamal's steps slowed, his eyes tracing the spot where it had all gone wrong. Marco nudged him. "You good?" Jamal nodded, but inside, he wasn't sure. The world had shifted beneath him, and he was still finding his footing. Yet as they walked on, the weight of his father's words, his mother's warmth, and even Marco's steady friendship anchored him. Justice wasn't just a check or a resignation, it was a fire, one that burned slow and long, and maybe, just maybe, he'd learn to carry it too. Marco stood hunched over a sleek pair of high tops, his fingers brushing the leather as if it held some secret worth uncovering. "Man, you're way too obsessed with these," Jamal teased, leaning against the display with a playful smirk. The fluorescent lights of the sneaker store buzzed faintly overhead, casting sharp shadows across the rows of shoes lining the walls. Marco straightened up, his grin wide and unapologetic. "They're not just any shoes, Jamal. These are the ones I don't have yet, there's a difference." His voice carried a spark of triumph. Like a collector savoring the thrill of the chase. Jamal rolled his eyes but couldn't help chuckling as they stepped out into the bustling mall corridor. The hum of voices and footsteps swallowing their banter. As they wove through the crowd, Jamal's gaze drifted across the polished tiles and landed on the luxury store opposite them. Its glass facade gleamed under the artificial lights, a beacon of wealth and prestige that made his stomach twist. The memory crashed into him like a rogue wave, sharp, cold, and unrelenting. He could still feel the weight of that day, the accusing stares, the clipped tone of the old manager, the suffocating shame that had clung to him like damp clothes. His steps faltered, and Marco, ever perceptive, followed his line of sight. "You good, man?" Marco's voice softened, tinged with concern as he nudged Jamal's shoulder. "Yeah," Jamal muttered, shaking his head as if he could dislodge the past. "Let's just keep moving." But as they walked, his head turned almost against his will, catching a glimpse of a new manager at the store's entrance. The man was all smiles, greeting customers with a warmth that felt alien to Jamal's memory of that place. Something about it, maybe the contrast, maybe the audacity of it, rooted Jamal's feet to the ground. "Hold up," he said, his voice low but firm, pivoting back toward the store. Marco's brow furrowed, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the tile as he stopped. "Wait, you're not seriously going in there, are you?" His tone hovered between disbelief and worry, but Jamal didn't answer. His pulse thrummed in his ears, a steady drumbeat urging him forward as he crossed the threshold. The air inside hit him first, crisp, perfumed with the faint scent of leather and wealth. Just as he remembered. The new manager turned to him, his face brightening with practiced ease. "Welcome. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." Jamal nodded stiffly, his throat tight, and ventured deeper into the aisles. Each step felt like a dare, a quiet rebellion against the humiliation that had once driven him out. The shelves towered around him, stacked with designer bags and shimmering jewelry, unchanged from that awful day. Yet the energy was different, less hostile, less suffocating. He paused at the watch display, his eyes locking onto a silver timepiece that glinted under the soft glow of recessed lights. It was the same one he'd admired weeks ago, its elegance taunting him with what he couldn't have back then. "Looking for something special?" The manager's voice broke through his thoughts, gentle but curious as he approached. Jamal hesitated, his fingers twitching at his sides. "No," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just looking." The man nodded and drifted away, leaving Jamal alone with the storm brewing in his chest. Defiance wrestled with unease, part of him wanted to claim this space, to prove it couldn't hurt him anymore, while another part screamed to run. That night, as the city lights flickered beyond their apartment window, Jamal sat across from his father, Christopher, recounting the impulsive visit. "You went back?" Christopher's eyebrows shot up, his fork pausing midway to his mouth. Surprise colored his tone, but there was something else too, pride, maybe, or curiosity. "Yeah," Jamal admitted, tracing the edge of his glass with his thumb. "I don't know why, exactly. I just needed to see if it felt different." Christopher set his fork down, leaning forward. "And did it?" Jamal shrugged, his gaze dropping to the table. "A little. But it's still not enough." His father's nod was slow, thoughtful, his eyes narrowing as if piecing together a puzzle. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Jamal. What matters is you took that step. Going back? That's courage, whether you feel it or not." Jamal didn't know if he bought that. Courage felt too grand a word for the tangle of anger and stubbornness that had pushed him through those doors. But as he lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling while the hum of traffic filtered through the walls, a tiny ember of something new flickered inside him, control, maybe. Or the faint outline of a story he could shape instead of just endure. The weeks that followed were a blur of noise and scrutiny. The lawsuit against the store dragged on, pulling Jamal and Christopher into a whirlwind of courtroom arguments, whispered doubts, and the relentless gaze of strangers who thought they knew their pain. Through it all, they clung to a shared resolve, to take a wound that had cut deep and forge it into something bigger, a call for change, a refusal to let that day define them. Months later. The case settled with a quiet thud. The store offered money, a public apology splashed across news feeds, and a promise to overhaul their practices. For Christopher, it was a win, though bittersweet. He stood in their cramped living room, hands on his hips, staring at the TV as the anchor droned on about progress. "It's not everything," he said, more to himself than Jamal. "Real change? That's not one case. It's persistence. It's keeping the fight alive." Jamal, slouched on the couch, didn't respond right away. The media circus had finally faded. And school was starting to feel normal again, friends joking in the halls, teachers moving on to new lessons. But the weight of it all still pressed against his ribs, a quiet ache he couldn't shake. Questions swirled in his mind, too big and slippery to pin down. Was this justice? Did it matter? Would anyone even remember? One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Christopher set his phone aside, a rare break from the endless stream of emails and calls that had become his lifeline. The clatter of plates filled the silence until Jamal spoke. His voice cutting through the mundane. "Dad, about what you said, how change takes time. Do you really think we'll see it? Like, will things actually get better?" Christopher looked up. His fork hovering, and met his son's searching gaze. He leaned back, chair creaking under his weight, and let out a slow breath. "Not all at once, no. But every move we make. Every stand we take, it's for the ones who come after us. That's what keeps me going." Jamal's brow creased, his fingers tapping the table. "But what if people forget? What if they act like nothing ever happened?" Christopher's eyes softened, but his voice held steady. "Some might. That's why we don't let them. Change isn't a straight shot, Jamal, it's a push. A grind. Even if the world doesn't shift as far as we want, we've done our part to nudge it forward." The words lingered, sinking into Jamal like rain into dry soil. The next weekend, Christopher dragged him to a community event, a small workshop tucked into a rec center gym, the air thick with the scent of sweat and old wood. Folding chairs were scattered in uneven rows, filled with kids not much younger than Jamal, their faces a mix of boredom and cautious hope. Christopher moved through the room with purpose, shaking hands and trading quiet words with organizers. While Jamal hung back, arms crossed, unsure of his place. The speakers took turns sharing stories, stumbles, triumphs, moments of standing tall against bias, and Jamal felt something shift. These weren't just voices, they were echoes of his own struggle, threads of a tapestry he hadn't realized he was part of. When Christopher called him up front, his stomach lurched. "This is my son." "Jamal," his father said, voice ringing with a pride that made Jamal's ears burn. "He's why I fight so hard. He's got more strength than he knows." The room turned to him, eyes wide and expectant. And Jamal shifted on his feet, heat creeping up his neck. "I didn't feel strong back then," he started, his voice shaky but growing steadier. "I felt humiliated, pissed off. But my dad showed me strength isn't about not being scared, it's about getting up anyway." The applause that followed was loud, raw, and for the first time, Jamal felt his story stretch beyond himself, touching something larger. Months later, a package arrived at their doorstep. Inside was the silver watch, the one Jamal had once dreamed of giving his mom, wrapped with a handwritten apology from the new manager. He handed it to her, his fingers lingering on the box. "It's not the same," he said softly, the words heavy with everything left unsaid. His mom opened it, her breath catching as tears welled up. She pulled him into a hug, her voice trembling. "No. It's better, because it's from you." Life crept back toward normal after that. Jamal started journaling, spilling his thoughts onto pages in messy, urgent scrawls that felt like exhaling after holding his breath too long. One day, Christopher found the notebook on the coffee table, flipping through it with a grin. "This is good, Jamal. Really good." Jamal shrugged, kicking at the rug. "It's just stuff I've been thinking." His father held it up, insistent. "People need to hear this. Your voice, it matters." Jamal mulled it over. The idea both thrilling and terrifying. "Maybe someday," he said, and Christopher's smile widened. "Take your time. But don't doubt what you've got to say." Years later, Jamal would look back on that day in the store not as the moment that broke him, but as the spark that set him ablaze. It wasn't just about his family's fight, it was about the man he became because of it, steady and sure in his own skin. The world didn't flip upside down overnight, but it tilted, bit by bit. He saw it in the kids who approached him at events, their voices tentative but bold, in the way his dad still fought, gray creeping into his hair but fire undimmed in his eyes. In the quiet confidence Jamal carried, a gift forged in the crucible of that struggle. Justice, he learned, wasn't a gavel's bang or a headline's blaze, it was the slow, stubborn work of building a world where worth wasn't a question but a given. And that, he knew, was a fight worth every step.